Good morning. Welcome to this panel on the effects of the ban treaty. I'm obliged to give you the customary injunction that questions are submitted through the app. I believe for this session the app will be open immediately, so you can start putting forward your questions from the beginning of this session. So just to set the stage for a moment, on July 7th, 2017, a vote in the UN General Assembly on the question of the ban treaty resulted in a 122-1 outcome in favor of the treaty. The one negative vote was the Netherlands. 69 states, including all of the nuclear weapon states, plus America's NATO friends and other allies, refrained from voting. But what we had was a result that showed roughly 2/3 of the UN membership supporting a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. The treaty opened for signature on September 20th of 2017. As of this morning, there are 70 signatories and 22 ratifications, so 22 state parties to this new convention. The big boosters of the ban treaty included Austria, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, and Thailand. Regionally, both Latin America and Africa more or less supported the treaty as a solid group. The treaty includes language which is quite sweeping, although in some ways reminiscent of the NPT. The critical article, Article 1.1, says that states undertake never under any circumstances to develop, test, produce, manufacture, or otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive devices. So that's the prohibition that is on the books as a legally binding commitment under the ban treaty. However, this is also a treaty that, if it enters force, will have some consequences. It's not purely inert as a piece of law sitting in a book somewhere. Among other things, Article 4 requires the creation of what is described in the treaty as a competent international authority to oversee the disarmament process. Article 8.1 suggests that the parties will meet regularly. Article 8.4 says that there will be, as with the NPT, review conferences every 5 years. So once the treaty enters force, there will actually be things that happen. It just won't sit there. So the question for this panel really is, what are the effects of this? Does it have a big effect on world opinion? Will it shape the behavior of states parties or states in general, whether nuclear weapon states or others? Will it have a large impact, no impact, a negative impact? So this panel is designed to try and address that question of the ban treaty irrelevant, path-breaking, or possibly counterproductive. There are people who take all of those stances. To address this question, we have four distinguished and diverse speakers. Tony Jaquez from Mexico, who is the political coordinator at the Mexican mission at the UN. We have Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who is the director of the Acronym Institute and also the founding director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize for its contributions to the ban treaty. We have Mr. Nicolas Roche from the French Foreign Ministry, where he's Director for Strategic Affairs, Security, and Disarmament. And last but far from least, we have George Perkovich, who is the Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment. So, Tony, let me start with you and ask, what is the expectation of a state like Mexico, a non-weapon state, when you see that none of the nuclear weapon states participated in the ban treaty negotiations, none of them signed up to it, all of them have basically criticized it, several of them have been quite emphatic about saying they have no intention of ever associating with it. So what impact do you think this is going to have? How do you see this affecting the behavior of the nuclear weapon states?
Thank you. First and foremost, this is a very critical question that is repeatedly thought about and at the core of many of the considerations related to the treaty. And it is a very valid concern. Nevertheless, I have to say with regret, because this is not something that I am very excited about, this is also something that is happening in other fields of knowledge. Unfortunately, some nuclear weapon states are not willing to join or ratify legally binding agreements. I have a list of some treaties that have not been signed or ratified by some of the nuclear weapon states that are very important for humanity, like the Protocol of Montreal, the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, the Law of the Sea, the ICC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Anti-Personal Landmine Treaty, the CTBT, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms and Discrimination of Women. And I mean, this is not the subject of the panel, but from our point of view, it is wrong to wait for the nuclear weapon states to join a treaty and to ratify it, to expect that it will have an effect or that it will be valid, because history has shown that that has not happened. Not any treaty is universal, unfortunately. Having said that, the expectation of nuclear weapon states joining is something that has to keep the ban treaty has to be kept alive. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. A lot of countries have said that they will not join. They might stand up to that assertion forever, but we don't know if that is going to happen. For the moment, given the circumstances that we have and with the pace of ratification, which is and joining of the treaty adherence, which is very good, it is more or less the same or even faster pace than other treaties of arms controls and pertaining to weapons, including the NPT and the CTBT, which has not entered into force yet. What we need to consider as a point of departure is the creation of the norm and how that norm can change dynamics at a local level, in the room, multilaterally speaking. Secondly, in the behavior and the norm of international regional partnerships, and also in international law in general. While a treaty enters into force, and I'm not a lawyer, so I apologize to all lawyers present here in order, because of what I'm saying, is what we have seen is that, of course, the law of the treaties and the international law is very clear about being legally binding only for the parties of the treaty. But at the same time, we have seen that when a norm is created and when there is a standard created and set as a horizon, it creates a change in behavior. And it creates a change in dynamics. So from the point of view of my country and a lot of supporters of the treaty, what we have expected is that there is a legally binding commitment and assertion that nuclear weapons cannot be considered as legal because of the humanitarian impact that they have. So if some countries have already asserted that in international legislation, for example, joining nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, which were the first prohibitions that we had. That is correct. But there was no prohibition of this type of a global nature and impact. And that was the expectation to sign and, well, to negotiate, sign, and ratify a global prohibition, like the one contained in the ban treaty. And finally, my last point is that if we are going to consider past behavior as a norm or as a demonstration or as a signal of how future behavior of international community can be, we can take some examples in the arms control regime by the prohibitions and restrictions on conventional weapons, and by the prohibitions and express qualification of some weapons of that mass destruction, like the chemical weapons or like the biological weapons. The stigmatization process and the qualification of the weapon is very important as a foundation of non-proliferation efforts. There would be no case in controlling the production of dual-use material if the weapons are legal. If there is an assertion that can be the foundation of non-proliferation, and in the case of nuclear weapons, also of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, of the agreement that we have had through the NPT of conserving the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, is the prohibition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's sort of go to the other end of the spectrum and talk with Nicolas for a moment. So, Nicolas, France has been particularly emphatic in insisting that it's not bound by the nuclear ban treaty and that it sees or assumes no additional obligations. So that's very clarifying from the point of view of one nuclear weapon state. Excuse me. There's also been a claim that in fact, this treaty can be counterproductive in the sense of complicating the diplomacy of the non-proliferation regime, creating divisions, being polarizing. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on both the French position and this notion that this is actually an unwelcome, possibly damaging development in the non-proliferation diplomacy.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the superb organization. I'm glad to be part of that panel with you. I'm the representative of a country that is a treaty-loving country. So I think in the long list that you put out, I think we probably check all the boxes, but not this one. Mm-hmm. And not this one for basic reasons. And I see that, Rebecca, you have the treaty here.
I do.
So the first thing we do when we look at a new treaty is we read it. And we are maybe a bit too Cartesian, but we take words at their core meaning. In that treaty, we see a number of internal weaknesses in the treaty itself, in a number of these articles that for us makes it simply impossible to demonstrate that the treaty would be, as I think you and a number have claimed, it's a complementary element to the NPT. And that's part of the argument. That's not the only part of the argument, but that's one important argument. And for us, when we read the treaty, there are a number of articles that we see that at the very least, to remain very diplomatic, raise questions. I just take a few examples that are very well known, but I put them on the table for the sake of discussion. Article 18, the famous Article 18, that talks about the articulation between the ban treaty and the other international norms. At the end of that article, there is a small sentence, a few words, that say basically that the ban treaty will take precedence over any other international norm where the obligations would not be consistent with the ban treaty. If you apply that to the NPT, its basics, it says that if there is inconsistencies in the implementation of the obligations between the NPT and the ban treaty, then this is the ban treaty that takes precedence. For us, that's a problem. Just the same way as it is a problem that to be a member of the ban treaty, you don't have to be a member of the NPT. And these were issues that were discussed during the negotiation. Amendments were put on the table, and they were voted against. So the first basket of question is why? It was very simple to have a basic clause in the treaty that would precisely articulate the NPT and the ban treaty. We don't see that in the treaty, and we see that as undermining the fact that the treaty, the key treaty in non-proliferation terms, will remain the NPT. I take just another example, and we can continue for long, but I will stop just after that second example. And it's related to the safeguards. We have been talking about what is the gold standard of safeguards on nuclear programs for decades now. I think there is a broad agreement in the international community that this is a mix of full-scope safeguards plus additional protocol, and that the IAEA has to be at the core of everything. And in the treaty, when we read the treaty, and there is an Article 3, if I'm not mistaken, that talks about the way to safeguard the implementation of the treaty. and it doesn't say anything about the additional protocol. And here also there were discussions, there were amendments that were tabled during the discussion. And we don't see that. And so for a treaty that pretends to be at the epitome of non-proliferation, it's a bit weird to see that the substance of the treaty is not consistent with what we have tried collectively to develop as the gold standard of safeguards in non-proliferation terms. Last example, there is a clause in the treaty that really triggers questions. Why is it that you felt the need to include a withdrawal clause in that treaty? Here again, if this treaty is really faithful to its stated objective, then why do you include a clause that says that in exceptional cases of national security, then you have the right to withdraw from the treaty? There is an inconsistency for us between the stated intention of the treaty and its substance. So I think there are a number of internal weaknesses and flaws in the treaty itself. But of course, I put the finger here because I think it's worth having that discussion here in that group of experts. And there are questions that have not been solved and answered that a number of have asked throughout the discussion. But there is another element that for us is related to what you said, Stephen, what we have said about divisions and polarization. We live at a moment, and I think the entire conference over the last days has demonstrated that we live in a time of really high tensions on the international scene, and polarization, and destruction of the legally binding arrangements that govern our nuclear world order. A number of arms control arrangements are being teared to pieces. And in that environment, the problem of the ban treaty is that it adds division to the division. And it's a strong difficulty to get to agreements, and we've been through that time and again, on Article 6 and nuclear disarmament and the next steps. What we strongly believe is that that treaty will not bring anything substantial in the real world in terms of real nuclear disarmament, and polarize more the debate and the discussion in the NPT REFCON next year in 2020 around the notion of nuclear disarmament and what needs to come. We have a very clear view as France of what we collectively need to do to implement our obligations under Article 6 to go towards nuclear disarmament and the general disarmament. I can give you a long list of what we have done, what we would like to see happening, what we are working on. I was in Beijing a few weeks ago for the P5 meeting. And so there are a number of ideas in the step-by-step approach where we believe that we should really put the international community together in preparing for next year. And unfortunately, the ban treaty for us is a distraction to that effort to recreate consensus among member states at the core of the NPT. And those two reasons, the legal and internal flaws in the treaty and the strong divisions that it will continue to increase, it does not create the division, it increases the divisions, are two negative trends that continue to explain why, among many other reasons, we'll continue to stay away from the treaty, and explain why, in a very honest, transparent way, why we don't believe it's the good solution to a real problem.
Great, thank you. So we've heard a bit about the logic behind the ban treaty. We've heard now some of the criticisms of the ban treaty. Turn to Rebecca. You've been involved from the civil society angle, and of course there's a public dimension to the nuclear question. And so how do you see the ban treaty fitting into this wider public dimension? Do you see an upsurge in mobilization against nuclear weapons? Do you think this will have a kind of long-term corrosive effect and this undermining the support for nuclear weapons? How would you describe the situation you see?
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to start by thanking Carnegie for holding this panel on the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty and for inviting me to come along and join you in this discussion, because you're quite right, we need to keep discussing this. So, I mean, people who know me know I've attended every NPT meeting since 1994, trying to make that treaty work more effectively in the terms in which it was understood, but recognizing that time had moved on from 1968. Also, the work that I did actually with many of you on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to negotiate, to get, from civil society's perspective, to get the governments into the CD, Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, to start those negotiations, and then to monitor what they were doing so that they wouldn't sell us short again. So when we think about civil society, what are we thinking about? We're not really thinking about people massing in the streets of nuclear-armed states as we did during the 1980s, which, by the way, certainly has been credited by President Gorbachev, and I believe more privately by certainly Nancy Reagan as having an influence on President Reagan in bringing them to Reykjavik for the INF Treaty. And the INF Treaty is a case in point. We, as civil society, as the doctors, the lawyers, the scientists, the members of parliament, elected representatives, in the cities, throughout, certainly, I mean, we have to, as Europe, we stand to lose so much of our security if the US and Russia, just the two countries that in the Cold War of the 80s were dominating decisions. So we let them be the ones that signed the INF Treaty, but we're not letting them wreck our security by playing fast and loose with it now 30 years later. So when we're thinking about the nuclear ban treaty, it was precisely because the world is changing, that this is no longer a world of the Cold War where the 5 declared or defined nuclear weapon states, nuclear armed states under the NPT, sort of controlled how we could make the NPT work, and quite often actually blocked us and blocked the non-nuclear weapon countries, who were in the vast majority, from making taking the steps. We would get agreement on the 13 steps, and by 2005, we couldn't even get the 2000 review conference agreements on the agenda. So it was in that mix where the non-nuclear countries, with civil society, and remember, we started ICAN and brought it to Geneva as the kind of, disarmament diplomatic country, to build the pressure onto the governments from so many different sources. And ICAN now has over 550 organizations in over 100 countries. It's a campaign network, not an organization. And in that campaign network, there are all levels of civil society, elected, expert, grassroots, right across the board. And when we think about the pressures that they're bringing, thank you to Washington, D.C. for adopting, I think it was a resolution, I'm not sure how the US system works, but something that essentially supports the ban treaty, just as the cities had to start adopting commitments for climate, to prevent climate destruction when your President Trump, tried to wreck the Paris Accord. So this is civil society action, even when the governments, even when the president. And let's remember, France didn't actually join the NPT until 1992. It takes time. Civil society, getting the treaty, bringing the nations to the United Nations in order to negotiate the treaty, and anyone who's been involved in negotiations, you have to make compromises. There's a lot of things in this treaty that, were the result of governments like this. I hope there's going to be a question where I can respond to the questions that Nicola raised specific to the treaty. I won't do that now because I want to respond to your question. But this is the way in which civil society is enabled to change. Essentially, what this treaty does, it removes the perceived political and legal barriers to accomplishing the goals, the non-proliferation and disarmament goals of the non-proliferation treaty. But it goes further. It takes into account that there's non-state actors out there who provide threats. It applies to them. It also has a prohibition against assisting anyone whatsoever to contribute to developing nuclear weapons. And so there's other kinds of initiative. Financing, Don't Bank on the Bomb, is a project within the ICAN family campaign in which we are persuading quite big funding, the Norwegian fund, the Deutsche Bank, to disinvest, to divest from nuclear weapons. So we're working with cities, with the mayors of cities, with the elected representatives, at parliaments and at the city, at the local level. This is civil society being empowered, but not just in the nuclear armed states, but all over the world, to take responsibility of our own security. Because as we heard from your Chairman Adam Smith, don't fire a nuclear weapon, don't start a nuclear war. You cannot win a nuclear war. Anatoly said this from Russia's perspective. You cannot win a nuclear war, so just don't start it. Well, the logic of that is just don't carry on making nuclear weapons. Get rid of them.
Okay, so now we have the civil society angle in the picture. George, you are known for having made an argument that actually the ban treaty could have some counterproductive effects, that it could produce backlashes that actually make the ultimate goal of nuclear restraint and nuclear elimination more difficult. Why don't you spell out for us that perspective?
Thanks, Stephen. Everybody's been gracious in thanking, Carnegie. In my case, since I know what's actually involved, I will again thank Toby Dalton and James Acton and Aaron McLaughlin and Lauren Dueck and the team, because I've actually been a free rider, like certain states in the system. Where I come from, a little bit of background would be, my sense is, there's a thing that we could call in ugly terms a nuclear order that was built over the last 74 years. And remarkably, nuclear weapons haven't been used in hostility to kill people in that time. And only one state joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, cheated and acquired nuclear weapons. So that's North Korea. So as international things go, that's a remarkably effective ordering that's predicated on restraints of different kind. And it's also been built on mutual obligations, reciprocal obligations, with some element of fairness, because if you don't have fairness in an order, ultimately you're going to require violence to impose it. And if you want it to be voluntary and nonviolent, it has to be basically fair. So to my mind, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons isn't causing unraveling or threats to that nuclear order, but it's a symptom of underlying causes. But I also don't think it's a cure to those causes. And everybody in the room, can list their favorite causes. And any cause you might outline, somebody else in a cafe someplace would say, oh, there's a deeper cause. And that's probably all true. But among them are the disparities in power, including military power around the world, where at least some of the weaker states in regions feel that without nuclear weapons, they would be subject to possible predation or aggression by stronger states. And with the UN system, especially the UN Security Council system, where the big powers are too divided to make that entity work to enforce peace and security. And so that's, to my mind, that's one of the big underlying causes. And then arms racing grows out of that. We can debate that forever. But one of the consequences of what Tony laid out and what Rebecca laid out in terms of the failures of the weapon states to deliver on their side of the reciprocal obligations and bargain of that nuclear order is we see various forms of disinvestment from the order. And I would say what we were hearing yesterday about the arms race and U.S.-Russia and modernization reflects kind of the one response to this disordering by the U.S. and Russia in particular, and India and Pakistan. Because I think the U.K. and France don't deserve to be lumped into that same category. And I'd even say Israel doesn't deserve to be either. The real dynamic is, U.S., Russia, China on the periphery of that, and India and Pakistan. And so they're disinvesting. And it seems to me that the Prohibition Treaty represents a kind of another kind of disinvestment out of protest to all that. And so we have this tension when what we need is kind of reinvestment, I would argue, in the order. Which brings me to my final point, which is generally I understand the impetus behind the treaty. I respect it. I want to talk about elements of it that I think are really useful for us to focus on more. My one concrete fear is that for states that are caught in the middle, so I'm thinking of democracies, first of all, in Europe, Japan, South Korea, maybe elsewhere in Asia, but mostly those governments and societies are caught in the middle. They currently are part of security arrangements with the United States that somewhat relies on nuclear deterrence. And they face, especially today, the sense of threat, emanating particularly from Russia or out of China with uncertain territorial ambitions. And you see this in the South China Sea. So these states are concerned about security issues that they don't feel yet enables them to do without nuclear weapons. And they have constituencies that are quite sympathetic to the idea of doing without nuclear weapons. And so my concern is if you force this issue at this moment, and those governments were going to have the equivalent of a referendum. In other words, if this became so salient, which it hasn't, but if it became a prominent enough issue that those governments were forced to choose between maintaining their alliances or giving up nuclear weapons and agreeing to this treaty, and they have time and money to spend on a campaign, I suspect that in at least a number of those countries, the decision would be to remain in a nuclear alliance. And in that case, the nuclear weapon states will see, aha, the people have spoken. We are no longer obligated to pursue disarmament because the people, when forced to choose, chose to maintain a security relationship that at least is partly based on nuclear weapons. And in that case, I think nuclear disarmament will be set back a long way, and precisely because I think, and James Acton and I have written about, nuclear disarmament should be an active objective of international politics. That's the worry that I have today.
Okay, terrific. So we've had four quite distinct perspectives on the ban treaty. I'm going to ask one question of each. I ask for a minute or two of reactions so we save some time for the questions from the audience. Tony, from you, I would ask for a minute or two on the question of how do you see the ban treaty affecting relations between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. Those politics have been complicated in any case, but now we have this additional factor.
Yeah,
very briefly. Please.
Very briefly, and I will start by responding to some of the comments, and I just want to say that of course we can debate about the state of play of the NPT before the ban treaty, and the ban treaty has not entered into force, so it is a present condition that the NPT is not in very good shape, and the discussion was already very divided and very polarized, and the polarization comes from the deep sense of frustration and disappointment from non-nuclear weapon states, because the Great Bargain has not been upheld or fulfilled in the same amount of intensity or equal enforcement from the point of view of nuclear weapon states that the way we see in the non-nuclear world. The other thing that is a direct impact is the reckoning. I see that non-nuclear weapon states have influence in the agenda in multilateral fora and have the ability to place items that are important for us in the agenda, and that has shifted the dynamics in the room. The third thing with that I end is the non-nuclear weapon states will have now the ability to reiterate and to reinforce international legislation with the prohibition. We don't see a disparity or an incompatibility in the same way that we didn't have that with the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Nikolai, I would ask you, can you envision conditions under which France and the other nuclear weapons would respond more favorably to something like the ban treaty?
No.
Perfect.
No, for
The ideal, concise answer, yes.
for basic reasons. There are two things that I think are important here and that are the core of our debate. The debate is about the relationship between nuclear disarmament and the security environment. And what the Ban Treaty does is to disconnect completely the disarmament from any surrounding environment in strategic or security terms. So the answer to your question, Steve, is basic no, because what we see happening, and Rebecca, you just mentioned that, is that the Ban Treaty in the best world will have no effect. But in the worst world, it will have an effect. And the effect will be to increase the asymmetry in the security between democracies and other countries. Because the ICANN movement, the whole movement, the only target is us as democracies. We don't see you campaigning in places as nice as Pyongyang or Tehran or other capitals that I cannot name here, but that would not correspond exactly to the definition of democracies.
I mean, I thought those were the two you couldn't name. You can name the others.
Exactly.
And to be honest, we've looked at it. We've looked at the Twitter campaign. The only target, the only objective is, and this is the same thing for Don't Bang the Bomb, it's about Europe. It's about liberal democracies in Asia. It's about us. So it's about, we are all representative here on this panel of modern liberal democracies with vibrant democratic public opinions. It's very true in Mexico, it's very true in France, it's very true in the UK, it's very true in the US. This is the only place. So if your campaign, if your efforts have an effect, it will be on those democracies and only on those democracies. And so what will happen if you have an effect is that you will basically undermine the security architecture of Europe. You would undermine the security architecture of Asia. And that asymmetry will, at the end of the day, create a situation where there will still remain nuclear weapons, but only in the hands of dictatorships. And that's something that is not part of the debate, and that is absolutely critical and central. And I think that debate is worth a better discussion than just us talking in our small bubble of liberal democracies. And I don't accept the assumption that basically ICANN or Mexico or anyone else is more ethical than we are as friends. And because a lot of things are related to the ethical dimension. And I'd love to have that discussion about the ethics of nuclear deterrence, because if you look back at nuclear history and the very first days of our nuclear history,
It's turning into a long 2 minutes.
it's a fascinating discussion, and there are a lot of arguments to be made against the Ban Treaty as the ethical solution to a good problem.
Rebecca, to you, I would ask for 2 minutes, really, your 2-minute answer to Nicola's criticisms.
Thank you. Security actually lay at the absolute core and heart of the decision of a growing number of governments to try to negotiate and now to bring into force and to make work a treaty that clearly prohibits nuclear weapons for everyone. Now, there's an inconsistency in what you said earlier, where you criticized us for not only engaging with what you call the nuclear weapon states, but for applying the treaty to states that haven't joined the NPT. That's part of the point, isn't it? Surely it's actually to recognize facts on the ground. There are 9 countries now armed with nuclear weapons. And whatever you call them, and however they were defined in 1968, we have to deal with the reality of the world today. And that means engaging, and indeed we do engage, and we engage civil society, scientists, politicians at every level in all of the nuclear-armed states in different ways, because some are easier to mobilize civil society in certain ways, and others you need to find ways to go in and talk to leadership. But the point is, security, if nuclear weapons were used even in a so-called limited nuclear exchange, do we call it that? No, it's a war. Then the consequences would be global. environmentally, in terms of climate, in terms of human suffering, the studies into famine because agriculture would collapse as a result of a relatively limited, less than 100 nuclear bombs was the baseline for the science study, looking at a region like India and Pakistan, and we were just reminded of the possibility of that. Not even unleashing their entire arsenals, but just a fraction of those. Now, on that basis, those facts and evidence were what we first of all brought back to governments, because everybody had kind of fallen asleep in the system. And then through that, governments themselves said, well, the major business of government is to protect your people, it's security. So what is the best thing that can be done? And we asked that question of every government and of the parliamentarians that make up most of the governments. And that's how we ended up with over 2/3 of the UN General Assembly deciding that the best way to deal with them was actually at least to make a treaty that was clearly prohibiting these weapons, that did not engage with the what ifs of government leaders deterring each other and always getting their communications and calculations right, because we know they don't, and we know they cannot be trusted to do that. So therefore, what do we need to do, the non-nuclear countries in the NPT and people throughout the 9 nuclear armed states? And that is to bring a new law into place that, as I said, would remove the barriers to completing and implementing the NPT, but would actually go further and deal with the people that could acquire, use, threaten to use, and also who could finance others to be using and producing and threatening to use. And that is the context.
On that point. So I think we're having a pretty clear illustration on this panel of the parallel universes between the opponents and the supporters of the ban treaty. George, if you could just give us a moment or two of reflection on how the ban treaty might play in the 2020 review process and whether you see it as a big complicating factor. But very briefly, please.
Yeah, I mean, one can speculate. I don't actually think it's going to be that big a deal in the 2020 review conference. It hasn't been that big a deal in the prep conferences, but then again, I don't put that much weight in review conferences anyway, so I could leave now, I suppose. But I just don't think that's where the issue is. I mean, I think the issue is in like I said, in democracies that right now are struggling politically, and that also are in an environment where security is uncertain in Europe and East Asia. I think that's the dynamic, and those polities, whether it's the parliaments, the political parties, aren't even aware that there's going to be a thing called a review conference. It won't be reported, and so I don't think that's it. It's the issue for people like us. But the underlying issue is more, how do we deal with security? And if the Prohibition Treaty actually became salient, which it hasn't been for the most part, then if you force people to make a decision, how that would turn out and what that would mean for international politics.
Great. Thank you for being concise. Let's turn now. We have almost half an hour for questions from the audience. I've got quite a list here. Let me start with a question from Jessica Buford, and I think what I'll do is direct each question to one person so that we can get through a number of these queries. So Jessica Buford says, one of the criticisms of the ban treaty is that it lacks effective verification measures. Are current states parties willing to amend the ban treaty to include more robust verification measures at some point, whatever those measures may be? And would that be possible without unpicking the whole agreement? Tony, maybe that's one for you since you're a state party.
Yeah, thank you. Well, current states parties are 22, so I really cannot speak for the 22 states parties. There is a provision for amendment in the treaty if the conference of the parties in the future, when it enters into force, decides that there is a valid amendment the treaty can be amended. I take this opportunity also to address another comment from the panel in this regard regarding the article to abandon the treaty, the announcement of the treaty, which is a standard in all treaties. So the Convention on the Law of the Treaties allows for that possibility, and that was a pattern followed in the ban treaty. The reason why, one of the reasons why the provisions for verification were not included in the negotiation have to do with the nature of the additional protocol, which is a voluntary agreement, and it is not accepted by the whole NPT membership as a golden standard, not by my government, but many countries feel that this is an additional, not binding or a voluntary measure in order to enhance the verification provisions of the NPT. So it was not agreed as an obligation from the NPT that had to be transferred into the treaty. But that can change in the future. More states are accepting this standard of verification or another one. And I repeat, if the member states that are parties to the treaty in the conference of the parties agree to an amendment, it can be amended.
Can I actually add something, because it is quite
Quickly,
important?
please.
Because I was involved with members of the International Panel on Fissile Materials from Princeton and others on verification. One of the things we did was we learned from the CTBT, the Test Ban Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Treaty, that if you put too much detail into the verification, the problem is that technologies and other aspects, both of cheating on verification and of verification, change over time. So what the treaty actually does is it provides an adaptability mechanism within it that is in the responsibility of the states parties. It doesn't require amendment, but it requires that the states parties look at what needs to be verified and how at each stage. And as part of this is a negotiation precisely with nuclear-armed or nuclear-dependent states with capabilities that, are part of the nuclear weapons nexus. As they sign, they take on certain obligations, not just immediately taking all their weapons off deployment, but also to start negotiations. And out of that will be developed a workable but also adaptable verification system that will, of course, work closely with the CTBT's monitoring and verification system, the International Atomic Energy Agency, but will very probably need to be involving new technologies and new ways to do verification so that we actually can feel increasingly secure as nuclear-armed states dismantle and destroy their arsenals.
Thank you. So Nobu Abe writes, perhaps nuclear weapon states will not sign the ban treaty anytime soon, but there's nothing wrong with the countries who don't have nuclear weapons reaffirming the ban. Why do weapon states campaign against those countries signing and ratifying? George, why don't you take that one?
I think the issue is to distinguish between those countries that are in alliances. And so let's talk about those. It's tricky. So if Article 5 of NATO says, basically if any one of us is attacked, all of us must come to the defense. And so if a number of those states are still relying on nuclear deterrence or nuclear contingencies, but now a couple of them have said, we're adhering to this treaty which prohibits any kind of cooperation in nuclear arrangements, then how do you operate the alliance? You can't, because, and this is one of the reasons several states, have rejected it, is because it prohibits even any kind of cooperation or questions about in defense industry. If you sell a bracket that goes on a plane that may be carrying a nuclear weapon, is that violating the treaty? All these kind of details, from the relatively trivial to the big one. If there's a conflict, are you obligated to not participate, and how do you maintain an alliance? I think that's the problem.
Miroslav Gregovich has a question submitted for Nicola. He says, if nuclear weapons are essential for the security architecture of France, why not allow other states to include nuclear weapons in their security architecture?
Because there is an NPT. It's good, all these questions, because I can keep my answers very, very short, right?
But it's the elaborations that I worry about.
One of the key elements I think that should make us all pause for a second is exactly what George has said. That countries like Japan or Germany or the Netherlands that are known to be very pro-disarmament, that have a specific interpretation of the Article 6, have decided to stay away from the ban treaty is in itself a cause for thinking, right? We read, because we read everything, the report that was put together by the Lundin Commission in Sweden. We read the report that was put together in Switzerland. Those countries are not particularly known to be pro-nuclear weapons lovers, right? And the long list of the flaws and criticisms are very clearly explained there. And so it is not just France as the nuclear weapons loving country that is a new convert to the NPT, with the faith of the new convert in the NPT, by the way. That's why we love the NPT way more than the ban treaty. Because as any new convert, we have the faith of the beginning.
South Africa joined the same time as you, and they were one of the leadership.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. But that should cause us to pause and think a bit. I would just add one element, and actually that's a question, because maybe I'm wrong, but in the Oslo Convention, the Ottawa Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Bio Convention, do you have withdrawal clause? To be honest, I don't think so. The same, an additional element, you were mentioning that.
But there isn't the NPT withdrawal.
I have to say, it was very, very hard
course,
fought, and you should know that.
It's beautiful. I cannot answer the question.
Most of us from ICANN, well, we can have a discussion, but with a withdrawal clause, we didn't want a withdrawal clause. It was countries like the Netherlands and others who were wanting to be basically saying, if there's no withdrawal clause, the nuclear armed states will never join it. We wanted a mechanism, a tool that we can use over time to increase the recognition against the possession and deployment and use of nuclear weapons. And a withdrawal clause in the end was what the government negotiators decided was going to make it a bit less scary for you.
But too bad it won't happen.
George, do you
I don't want anyone to
But I mean,
let George have a word here.
I mean, the withdrawal clause itself is very problematic. I mean, in other words, whether there's one in there is problematic, but then once it's in there, basically, you can't withdraw until after 12 months of the cause that made you want to withdraw, at which point, presumably, you're dead. And so it's problematic in its own right.
But that also, look at the NPT.
If I may, I'd like to add one sentence.
Withdrew.
Because I'd like to come to the core of the discussion, I think, that is not about the nitty-gritty details of the clauses. It's about, once again, I come back to that critical point that George made. It's about the articulation between security and disarmament. And once again, we've never said that in the future or forever, nuclear weapons will have to remain a critical element of the defense and security of our countries. What we have said is that when we look at the world as it is today, and it is not any longer the world of the 90s or the beginning of the 2000s, the situation has changed again. The problem is that you are still stuck in the 2000s, where the world we live in right now is way more dangerous. And it's not the Cold War redux. It's even worse than the Cold War, because this is about escalation of local conflict. It's about ambiguity. It's about strategic intimidation. It's about a movement of nuclear doctrines in a direction that is moving away from pure deterrence. This is the key problem of security we face today. This is the problem we have to address. This is where we have to put our heads together and think anew what risk reduction really means, what arms control is really about, how to move disarmament in the right direction. That's the core discussion we need to have. And we continue to have that discussion in the parallel universe that you mentioned. But I would love to live in your universe, guys. But unfortunately, the universe I have as a representative of the French government to live in is a way more dangerous environment.
But I need to make a point. I think that it is, if I may qualify this as a little bit unfair, to say that non-nuclear weapon states have never any security problems or have never considered security as the basis of their policies. In fact, I know that we don't live in the 1960s, but in the 1960s, many countries chose by a sovereign decision never to pursue the nuclear option. And that in the nuclear weapon-free zones treaties. And those are not treaties that were natural or that were already in place. In fact, they were negotiated before the NPT. France is part of the Tlatelolco Treaty, by the way. And thank you for having signed the protocols.
With NSAs.
With NSAs, thank you. But the idea that non-nuclear weapon states have no consideration of nuclear security or global security at all, it is not fair. It is a different point of view, but it is not fair. And the same concern that non-nuclear weapon states have in global security and the investment they have in global security is why we continue to uphold our obligations and commitments under the NPT. So if we continue saying that the only countries that respect or adhere to global security norms are the nuclear weapon states. No, I'm not saying that you said, but if we continue as the saying that the non-nuclear weapon states don't have a say in nuclear security, that can harm the NPT even more.
This is also a world where there's cyber means. Nuclear weapons are a 20th century technology for 20th century political military relations. There's now quite a number of means. We've talked about cyber, Chatham House and various other think tanks represented here have looked into that combination with nuclear weapons and said this increases the risks. So deterrence relies on or nuclear weapons for deterrence, which, of course, the Gang of Four, also, Kissinger and Schultz, said was of declining effectiveness and increasing, I've not got the quote exactly right, but danger. They understood that the world has changed. I just don't think some of the people in the nuclear armed states that are clinging to nuclear weapons that they cannot use, but that could potentially end up being used against them through technologies that we are only still getting a grip on.
It maybe says something about the controversial nature of this issue that I and the audience have become irrelevant. But let me try to go back to the audience questions. Jessica Slate asks, what do those working on the ban see as the path to getting nuclear-armed countries to sign? And if the treaty goes into effect, does this precipitate any new mechanisms to put pressure on nuclear-armed countries and key allies to join? Tony, why don't you take that one as the representative of the ban? The signing, the adherence of any treaty, of a government to any treaty, is a sovereign decision of the countries. There is not, this treaty qualifies, as I said before, the weapon. It is not a qualification on the governments. It's not a qualification on the states. It's a qualification on the weapon. And the countries have the sovereign right to consider this treaty as compatible with their national legislation or not, and take their path to join in the way their legislative process requires. That's why the ratification pace can be slow for some countries and quicker for others, depending on their national legislation. There is very little that other governments can do on that process, unless we intervene, and which is not the case for many of the parties, actually. So there is very little that we can do. Civil society can exert
pressure and convincing. And of course, this is not a part of the question that is for me to answer. But governments need to continue working with the non-parties of the treaty in collaboration through other mechanisms like the NPT and the CTBT, the ones that are parties to this treaty, and to the mechanisms established for the functioning of these treaties, in order to ensure the compatibility and the fulfillment of the obligations of all the treaties in the same manner. So that is what we can continue doing. And that's what has happened in other bodies of law with different memberships of the treaties. That hasn't stopped dialogue and collaboration amongst member states. But it is a sovereign decision by each state.
Dr. David Cooper writes, extended deterrence is seen by many as a key enabler of nonproliferation by convincing certain powers that they did not need to acquire their own nuclear weapons in order to deter coercion by nuclear-armed rivals in their region. Given that the ban treaty in effect seeks the delegitimization of extended deterrence, could this inadvertently have a negative impact on nonproliferation? George, why don't you take that one?
I think it could have, I think the answer to that is yes, but as I suggested, I think before that would happen, or in reaction to that happening, it would have an inadvertent, it would impose inadvertent damage on disarmament, partly in reaction to that possible scenario. So if you start creating a sense of security crisis, NATO's unraveling, the political contestation between the Netherlands and Germany and France over this issue, because one of them is signing the treaty and opting out and causing confusion within NATO, and then the recriminations over all of that because of the loss of extended deterrence, I think would likely over time tilt more of those governments to say, well, wait a minute, we want to preserve the alliance, including the nuclear deterrent part, and actually you're going to set disarmament back. So neither one of those things, it seems to me, is advisable, and it goes to the problem that I think Nicola raised, which is if one of the objectives of the current Russian government, not former Russian governments, current Russian government, is to split Europe, to split NATO, this helps. If one is worried about kind of where the Chinese government is going in terms of its perception of the future ordering of East Asia, then to have kind of friction only amongst the democracies in Asia, but not within China on this issue, I think is not advisable at this moment. And all that relates to extended deterrence.
I think President Trump is probably a greater problem there than the nuclear
totally
ban
agree.
treaty.
I totally agree with that. Trump's the best thing for the ban treaty. I mean, I got it.
There are, several questions along the lines of what else, if not the ban treaty, could the nuclear weapon states do. So I'll just read one of them and perhaps direct it at you, Nicola. Mm-hmm. If nuclear weapon states won't ban the treaty, what tangible steps should they take to promote disarmament and demonstrate real concern about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, especially ahead of the 2020 NPT review conference?
Can I after him?
You want to go on that one too?
Well,
sure.
Well, no, I think that's the question. I mean, I think that's really the fundamental question, and it's the one we ought to keep asking. Even here at our conference, and we talked about it, we debated about it. We didn't focus specifically on bringing scientists in and doing the debate on nuclear winter, for example. We didn't talk about, are there ways physically to alter nuclear arsenals to reduce the destructiveness. Now, that would be lower numbers and lower yields, which gets into a very interesting question that Adam Smith raised in nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon. Well, not from a humanitarian point of view, and not from an environmental point of view. Yields and numbers matter. But that opens up a whole other issue that is worth talking about. But the issue that I think we ought to focus more on is accountability. And the treaty does that. The Prohibition Treaty, Article 7, does focus on accountability, but it's getting lost in the prohibition piece of it, which is, and accountability is all right, fine. Nuclear weapon states say we're responsible stewards, it's just deterrence, we know what we're doing, we're sober. Fine, then be accountable for the consequences if in fact you use these weapons. And accept that there would be a tribunal if anybody's alive after that. It'd be a post facto tribunal if you're so confident that you would only do this in legal and just circumstances, then be willing to be held accountable. Say to the non-nuclear weapon states, if there are refugee crises after a war that we caused, that there will be ways of assisting and redressing that. These are the kind of things I think motivate a lot of the countries in the global south who get no benefit from deterrence, but then they look, wait a minute, if these guys have a nuclear war, we get nuclear winter, starvation, and refugees, and they're just going to say, what? Are they going to provide any? Will they even accept responsibility? Well, that's not something we ever debate. It's not something we ever talk about, and I think we should.
I was directing that at you, so do you want to have a word?
With pleasure.
Quickly, please.
Sure. I think there are different things that we can do, and they do not pertain all to the same category. Mm-hmm. I think there are the classical discussions that have been going on for years, unfortunately, without much progress. And here, our key top priority for France will remain FMCT and CTBT. For reasons for us that are obvious, we've done it nationally. So we've dismantled our fissile material production and our test facility. So we don't have them, and there is no way we can actually recreate them. So our best interest is actually the same as yours, which is to make that everyone in the world has the same concrete physical constraint on its nuclear arsenal, which are the CTBT plus the FMCT. That's the absolute must for us. So that's the classical discussion. A few years ago, we went the extra step of even putting a draft FMCT treaty on the table. And unfortunately, we continue to see that some countries are not interested in investing efforts, political, technical, and legal, into a real FMCT and CTBT negotiation. So I would say that's the absolute must. But even if we do that, we'll not be faithful to the world we live in. And that's the category I would like to put the emphasis on here. It's all about doctrines, transparency, and risk reduction, and arms control. That basket, actually, we collectively lost the ability to think about it over the last 25 years. And we have to relearn that strategic grammar that talks about how do we reduce the risk of nuclear escalation, the crossing of nuclear threshold? How do we recreate strategic stability? What's the role of other legally binding arrangements or non-legally binding, like mil-mil connections, transparency elements, discussion on doctrines, because we see a movement of nuclear doctrines and arsenals in the world precisely towards what looks like tactical use or warfighting capabilities. As for us, nuclear deterrence is, as was said by the ICJ, it's the ultimate guarantee of our basic survival. So it's the pure deterrence strategy. We France, since day one, have adhered to that chemically pure deterrence strategy. And you might question it, but I think that's one of the core elements of the problem. And the last basket of issues, and we have to rethink that anew, because that's not the problem of the Cold War. What we risk is not basically an out-of-the-blue first disarming nuclear strike between the two major powers. This is really how to avoid the beginning of a conflict that could escalate unintentionally towards the nuclear threshold. And the last basket is about more technical issues, and we reluctantly, I recognize that, enter that, but and that's all about verification. The verification of nuclear disarmament and DIP and DV. And here also we have the faith of the new convert. After some concerns, we have decided actually to go with Germany and to have a bilateral exercise in Jülich in a civilian facility in Germany at the end of September, precisely to see how we can cooperate between a nuclear weapon state and a non-nuclear weapon state in understanding exactly and specifically what it would take to have a very specific verification mechanism for disarmament. And I think those three elements, those three baskets, I mean, that's a reasonable positive agenda. And I think this is where we should converge all together, because that's the agenda that would connect Article 6 with the security environment in a way that will increase our collective security and not create division or undermine key alliances that remain core for our security.
Great. One of my responsibilities, maybe the main one, is to close on time. We're more or less out of time, so I think I'm going to end the question phase there. I think what we've seen here is how we're now living in a world where, on the one hand, countries like the United States are in the early stages of a 30-year, $1.5 trillion nuclear modernization program, but in parallel with the modernizations of other nuclear weapon states. And on the other hand, we have 2/3 of the UN General Assembly committing itself to a treaty that bans nuclear weapons. And so there is a huge chasm, and it's a chasm that has the potential to ripple through a lot of our nuclear diplomacy. And I think conversations like this very much help lay out the contours of the discussion, make us understand the nature of our divisions, and perhaps enable us to comprehend one another a little bit better. So we will now have a break for half an hour. The next session will resume, I believe, at 11:15, and it remains only for me to thank these wonderful panelists for their interesting interjections.